For thousands of years, humanity has stared at the same stones, massive, immovable, silent. Standing on Salisbury Plain in the south of England, like sentinels from another age, they have watched civilizations rise and collapse around them. They have endured ice ages, invasions, plagues, revolutions, and the relentless erosion of time itself. And yet, they remain. Stonehenge has outlasted every explanation ever offered for it. Every theory, every expert, every generation that dared to call itself enlightened. And now in 2025, an artificial intelligence, something that does not dream, does not fear, does not pray, has looked at this ancient monument and said, I think I know what this is. And what it said next has sent a tremor through the world of archaeology that has not stopped shaking. This is not a story about ancient rocks. This is a story about humanity's oldest secret and the terrifying possibility that we may have finally cracked it open. Before we go any further, you need to understand something about Stonehenge that most documentaries conveniently skip. This structure was not built in an afternoon. It was not even built in a single century. The construction of Stonehenge unfolded across roughly 1,500 years, from approximately 3000 BCE to 1500 BCE, meaning that the people who completed it lived thousands of years after the people who first broke ground. Think about what that means. 1,500 years of deliberate, continuous generational effort. The entire span of the Roman Empire does not cover that window. The distance between Julius Caesar and the world you are sitting in right now is shorter than the distance between Stonehenge's first builders and its last. Whatever this place meant to the people who built it, it meant it badly enough that generation after generation, century after century, kept returning, kept adding, kept sacrificing, kept believing in whatever purpose drove them to haul impossibly heavy stones across impossible distances in service of a project none of them would live to see completed. The sarsen stones, those enormous upright slabs capped with horizontal lintels across the top, weigh up to 25 tons each. They were quarried at Marlborough Downs, over 25 kilometers away from the site. The blue stones, smaller but no less mysterious in their precise placement, were brought from the Presley Hills in Wales, a journey of over 250 kilometers. No wheels, no horses, no cranes, no roads, no written engineering plans, and yet they arrived. They were shaped with extraordinary, almost obsessive precision, surfaces ground smooth, mortise and tenon joints carved so that the lintels lock onto the uprights. They were raised into positions that align, with a specificity that simply cannot be accidental, to the rising sun on the summer solstice and the setting sun on the winter solstice. Every year without fail, the light enters the monument in exactly the same way, falls on exactly the same spot. The monument is, at minimum, a machine for measuring time built by people who had no clocks, no telescopes, and no written astronomy. But machines do not require sacrifice. Machines do not require 1,500 years of devotion. There is something more here. There has always been something more here. The question is, what? Archaeologists have offered answers for centuries, and every answer has captured a part of the truth without ever capturing the whole. The Druid temple theory came first and proved false almost immediately. The Druids arrived in Britain long after Stonehenge was already ancient beyond memory, already a ruin to cultures that did not know who had built it. A royal burial ground was proposed next. Cremated human remains have been found at the site in the hundreds, across multiple excavation campaigns spanning decades, suggesting the location was used as a cemetery for elites across many successive eras. An astronomical calendar was the dominant theory for much of the 20th century, supported by the solar alignments, but incomplete as an explanation for the scale of effort involved. Why does a calendar require 250 kilometers of stone transport through terrain with no roads? A place of healing was proposed more recently. Isotopic and skeletal studies have identified individuals who traveled hundreds of miles to reach Stonehenge in conditions suggesting serious illness or injury, pointing to a widespread and powerful belief in some curative sacred energy concentrated at this specific location. Every explanation captures something real. None of them captures everything. And for a long time, that was simply where the conversation ended, in productive uncertainty and honest archaeological humility. Then came GROK. GROK is the artificial intelligence developed by xAI, Elon Musk's AI research company, designed from the beginning to be different from its competitors. Where other large language models were trained to be cautious and to retreat behind disclaimers, GROK was built to engage, to push into difficult territory, to follow a line of reasoning wherever it led, even when that destination made people uncomfortable. And when researchers began feeding GROK the totality of Stonehenge's archaeological record, excavation reports spanning over a century of fieldwork, astronomical alignment data, isotopic analyses of human remains, acoustic studies conducted inside and around the monument, geological surveys, comparative analyses with other megalithic sites across Europe and beyond, GROK did not produce a diplomatic, hedged summary. It produced a synthesis a pattern recognition that human researchers, siloed within their individual disciplines and bound by the professional norms and institutional cultures of their respective fields, had never managed to assemble in quite this form. What GROK identified was not one thing. It was a convergence, a web of connections that, when pulled together, pointed toward a single staggering conclusion about what Stonehenge actually was and what it was fundamentally designed to do. The starting point was acoustic archaeology, and this is where the analysis immediately becomes strange. Acoustic archaeology studies how ancient spaces were deliberately designed to manipulate sound, and Stonehenge is an acoustic marvel of a very specific and intentional kind. Studies conducted by researchers at the University of Salford, expanded through the Acoustics and Music of British Prehistory project, demonstrated that the stone arrangement creates a distinctive and reproducible soundscape, unlike anything in the surrounding natural landscape. Sound reverberates between the monoliths in specific geometry-determined ways. Certain frequencies, particularly those produced by large skin drums and human voices operating in the lower registers, become amplified, distorted, and spatially transformed in ways that create a profound perceptual effect. A person standing inside the circle while rhythmic sound is produced at the right frequencies experiences something genuinely disorienting and powerful. The sound surrounds them completely, impossible to locate, coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, dissolving the ordinary perceptual anchors that tell a human being where they end and the world begins. This effect is, in neurological terms, capable of reliably inducing altered states of consciousness in participants, states that cultures across the entire span of human history have associated with contact with the sacred. The positioning, the spacing, the height ratios of the stones, they all contribute to this specific acoustic outcome. The builders of Stonehenge understood how a range stone affects sound, and they built this thing to produce a specific effect on the human mind. GROK cross-referenced this acoustic data with the isotopic analysis of human remains found at the site. Isotopic analysis reads the chemical signature locked into bones and teeth during childhood. The food and water consumed in early life carries isotopic ratios that match the geology of the region where a person grew up, and those ratios are preserved for thousands of years in skeletal tissue. When archaeologists applied this technique to remains found at and around Stonehenge, the results upended assumptions about who was coming to this place and from how far. People buried at Stonehenge came from Wales, from Scotland, from continental Europe, France, Germany, Scandinavia. One individual appears to have grown up somewhere in the Mediterranean, possibly in North Africa. These were not locals. These were pilgrims who had crossed hundreds of kilometers of trackless terrain to reach this specific known and famous place. Some of them never went home. They died at Stonehenge, or close enough to it that their remains were brought there for interment. It mattered that they were buried there. Even in death, proximity to this place carried a meaning that proximity to any other place did not. Now hold all of this together simultaneously. Stonehenge drew the sick and injured from hundreds of miles away. It drew pilgrims from across the known world over thousands of years. It produced a sonic environment specifically calibrated to dissolve ordinary consciousness and induce states that every human culture in history has associated with contact with the sacred. It was aligned to the sun with a precision that required generations of accumulated astronomical observation before the monument could even be properly positioned. And it was maintained continuously and devotedly across 1,500 years of deliberate generational effort. GROK's synthesis, and this is the point at which the analysis becomes genuinely disturbing, is that Stonehenge was all of these things simultaneously, in integrated service of a singular and overarching function. Stonehenge was a portal, not in the science fiction sense, a portal in the cognitive, neurological, and spiritual sense, a purpose-built machine for altering human consciousness at scale, engineered to produce in its participants a unified, overwhelming, and repeatable experience of contact with something that transcends ordinary experience. A controlled, architecturally engineered, generationally maintained encounter with what religious traditions across all cultures and all of recorded history have called the sacred. Think carefully about what this means. Roughly 5,000 years ago, before the concept of psychology existed as a formal discipline, before anyone had the neuroscientific vocabulary to describe altered states of consciousness, before written language existed in Britain at all, a group of people understood something profound about the architecture of human awareness. They understood that consciousness can be transformed through specific environmental conditions, through rhythmic sound at specific frequencies sustained over time, through light entering at precisely calibrated moments, the blinding brilliance of the solstice sunrise flooding through the heel stone into the geometric heart of the circle at exactly the predicted moment every single year without fail, through the physical presence of generations of honored dead interred in the earth beneath the stones, making the boundary between living and departed communities deliberately permeable, deliberately accessible. Through the overwhelming scale of a monument that dwarfs every human being who approaches it and communicates without a single word, that something here is larger than any individual life or any individual generation could fully contain. They understood all of this, and they built a machine to harness it, a machine from stone that has outlasted everything else they ever made. But GROK went further still, and this is where the analysis crosses from surprising into genuinely unsettling territory. The isotopic data, when combined with careful archaeological dating evidence, begins to indicate when the pilgrimages were at their most intense and concentrated. And the peaks in activity do not correlate cleanly with the solstices alone, which is what you would expect if this were primarily a calendrical monument. They appear instead to correlate with periods of environmental and social stress, with climate disruption events that prehistoric agricultural societies would have experienced as catastrophic and existentially threatening, with archaeological evidence of conflict and social fragmentation in the wider landscape. Stonehenge was not merely a site for celebration and seasonal ceremony. It was a site for crisis, a place where, when the world threatened to fracture beyond repair, when harvests failed, when communities turned on each other, when the accumulated certainties of the existing order began to dissolve, people gathered from across the known world to perform whatever collective ritual they believed could hold things together, to reassert, through shared experience of overwhelming acoustic and visual and ancestral presence, that there was still an order to the world, that it still made sense, that the community still existed and still mattered. This transforms the understanding of Stonehenge entirely, because it means the monument was not peripheral to its society. It was load-bearing. It was the mechanism through which social cohesion was maintained and regenerated during the periods of maximum existential pressure on that cohesion. It was the institution, if we can call something built from 25-ton stones an institution, that kept whatever political and cultural order existed from disintegrating when the stresses on that order became almost unendurable. And that means the people who controlled access to Stonehenge, who decided who could enter and when, who determined what rituals were performed in what sequence, who were the custodians of the acoustic and astronomical knowledge embedded in the structure's every dimension. Those people held a form of power that has no precise modern equivalent. Not quite priests in the religious sense, not quite kings in the political sense, something earlier than both categories, and perhaps more fundamental than either, the power to define the terms of reality for an entire community through controlled encounter with the overwhelming. What makes GROK's approach genuinely novel is not merely the synthesis of existing data, but the way it triangulates between fields that have almost never spoken to each other directly. Archaeoacoustics, isotopic bioarchaeology, environmental archaeology, cognitive neuroscience of religious experience, and comparative mythology are all separately mature disciplines with their own journals, their own conferences, and their own professional cultures. A researcher who spends a career studying acoustic resonance in megalithic monuments almost never sits down with a researcher who specializes in the isotopic analysis of ancient human remains, and neither of them regularly collaborates with a cognitive neuroscientist studying the neurological basis of transcendent experience. The institutional structure of modern knowledge production actively prevents the kind of synthesis that GROK performed. It is not that individual researchers are incurious or narrow. It is that professional systems of recognition and reward make true interdisciplinary synthesis difficult, risky, and professionally unrewarding. GROK has no career. It has no professional norms to honor. It simply followed the data wherever it led, across every boundary that would have stopped a human researcher in their tracks. Consider what an experience inside Stonehenge during its active period would have actually felt like for the people who made that journey. You have walked for weeks, possibly months, from your home community hundreds of kilometers away. You are arriving at a place you were told about as a child, a place your grandparents and their grandparents before them spoke of with reverence and awe. You arrive in the gray light before dawn, surrounded by hundreds or thousands of other people who have made the same journey from equally distant places, speaking languages you cannot understand, wearing clothes and carrying objects unlike anything you have seen before. You enter the circle as the ritual begins. The drums start, low, resonant, physically felt in the chest, and within moments the sound is no longer coming from anywhere identifiable. It fills the space. It fills your body. It seems to come from inside you. And then, at the precise moment that the horizon has been calculated across generations to predict, the sun appears, not merely above the horizon, but directly in the alignment the entire monument has been constructed to frame. A shaft of light cutting through darkness, entering the circle at exactly the point it was designed to enter, falling on exactly the spot it was always going to fall on. And in that moment, surrounded by sound that has dissolved your sense of individual boundaries, watching light arrive at a location that generations of your ancestors prepared for it, you experience something that no language you own has adequate words for. something that will send you home different from how you arrived. GROK's final and most unsettling observation concerns the pattern that emerges when Stonehenge is viewed not in isolation, but as part of a wider prehistoric phenomenon. There is a pattern across multiple megalithic cultures: Stonehenge in England, Newgrange in Ireland, Karnak in France, the temples of Malta, the great circles of Orkney. A consistent pattern in which these structures are built to specifications that exceed any purely practical requirement. The solar alignments are more precise than a functional agricultural calendar demands. The acoustic properties are more sophisticated than communal ritual alone requires. The labor investment is vastly greater than the visible practical utility can justify. In every case, these structures represent deliberate and magnificent over-engineering, a level of effort that implies the builders were working to a standard that came from somewhere outside themselves, a standard they believed had been given to them rather than invented by them. GROK's interpretation is the part of its analysis that researchers find hardest to dismiss and hardest to fully accept. These cultures believed, with a conviction so absolute it drove 15 centuries of construction, that if they built this thing correctly enough, something would respond. They were not building monuments to honor gods assumed to be indifferent to architecture. They were building receivers, signals, demonstrations of capability and devotion sufficient to initiate contact from whatever they understood to lie beyond the visible world. The terrifying question this raises is not whether supernatural entities exist. The terrifying question is simpler and more immediate. Were they functionally right? Did the machine work? Did the altered states it reliably produced create something real in the minds and communities of its participants? Did the social cohesion it generated in moments of maximum crisis actually save communities that would otherwise have fragmented and collapsed? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, then the builders of Stonehenge achieved something that every sophisticated civilization since has largely failed to replicate. They engineered meaning at scale across 1,500 years, and they built it so well that 5,000 years later, the mechanism still stands, still aligned, still catching the same light at the same moment of the same annual cycle. There is a clear and understandable reason why this analysis has not been universally welcomed by the archaeological establishment. The field has spent decades fighting off pseudoscientific theories about Stonehenge: the ancient aliens hypothesis, the Atlantean builders hypothesis, the lost advanced technology hypothesis. There is a professional reflex, earned through painful experience, to treat any sweeping new synthesis with extreme skepticism. GROK is not a peer-reviewed scholar. It cannot be cross-examined at a conference. It does not stake a professional reputation on its conclusions. But here's what the skeptics cannot easily dismiss. GROK did not invent the data it analyzed. Every piece of evidence it drew upon exists in the published academic literature, produced by credentialed researchers using rigorous methods. What GROK did was synthesis, connecting data points that individual disciplines, separated by professional culture and institutional boundaries, had never fully connected. And the connections are real. Several archaeologists who have examined the pattern GROK identified have quietly acknowledged that it does not contradict their data. It reframes it into a coherent picture that no single discipline had produced alone. That is not a small thing. In the history of scholarship, moments when new synthesis reframes accumulated data without contradicting it have a name. They are called paradigm shifts. They are usually uncomfortable. They are usually resisted. And they are usually eventually recognized as correct. The history of science is full of breakthroughs that arrived from outside the established framework, from perspectives that did not have loyalty to existing theories or careers to protect. The patterns that institutional insiders could not see because they were too invested in defending what they already believed. GROK has no career to protect, no grant application pending, no theory to which it has staked its professional identity. It looked at Stonehenge the way no human researcher could, with all the data at once, across all disciplines simultaneously, without hierarchy or institutional allegiance. And what it saw may be the most complete account of this monument's purpose that 5,000 years of human curiosity has ever managed to produce. And if GROK is right, if Stonehenge was indeed a machine for engineering transcendence, a crisis management system for prehistoric societies under existential pressure, a receiver built by people who believed with complete operational certainty that the universe would answer if they asked correctly enough, then we are left with a question that reaches far beyond the boundaries of archaeology or history. We are left with the question of what exactly we have lost, because whatever Stonehenge gave to the people who built it, whatever it provided that compelled generation after generation for 15 centuries to haul 25-ton stones across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain and raise them into perfect alignment with the movements of the sun, we do not have it anymore. Not in any comparable form. We have replaced it with systems that are more efficient, more scalable, more technologically sophisticated in every measurable dimension. And none of them work as well for the most fundamental human need, which is the need to feel that existence is meaningful and that the community you belong to is real. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves careful attention before we close. The discovery that Stonehenge functioned as an engineered consciousness transformation system does not merely change how we understand one prehistoric monument in one corner of England. It changes how we understand the entire arc of human civilization. Because if the builders of Stonehenge possessed, through empirical observation and generational experimentation, without any of the conceptual tools of modern science, a working understanding of how to reliably alter human consciousness in service of social cohesion and collective resilience, then this knowledge was not unique to them. Similar structures, built to similarly excessive specifications, appear at roughly the same period across much of the prehistoric world, which means that what Stonehenge represents is not an isolated genius, but a discovery, or perhaps a transmission, of something fundamental about the human mind and about what communities need in order to survive the pressures that time and nature inevitably place on them. The GROK analysis does not merely uncover what Stonehenge was. It reveals that the oldest and most durable human technology was not the wheel, and not fire, and not agriculture. It was the deliberate engineering of shared transcendence. And we have been living on the eroding capital of that technology ever since, without fully understanding what it was or how badly we need to find a way to build it again. The stones are still there. The alignment still works. The light still enters at the same moment every year. And every year, thousands of people gather at Stonehenge for the solstice, not because a government mandated it, not because a priest commanded it, not because a king required it, but because something in the human animal still responds to that light, still feels the pull of that alignment with a force that 5,000 years of civilization and technology has not managed to dissolve, still reaches, instinctively and without fully understanding why, for whatever it is that the ancient people who built this impossible structure were trying to find. They found something. The machine worked. The question that GROK has now placed on the table, in language cold and precise and entirely without sentiment, is whether we even remember what we were originally looking for, and whether anything we have built since, in all our centuries of accumulated sophistication, comes even close to giving us back what we lost when we stopped looking.